Abandoned, a mother bear brings 6 cubs through the snow. What happens next is a true miracle. Deep in the heart of a snow-covered forest, a lone mother bear struggles against the unforgiving winter, carrying a burden that seems impossible, a family of 6 tiny cubs clinging to survival. This is not just a story of nature's resilience, it's a journey of hope, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her young. What happens next will leave you speechless and inspired. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to join us for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of the strength found in unexpected places. Let's begin. The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, half buried in snow, its pitched roof sagging under the weight of January's endless barrage. Inside, Rachel Delaney sat hunched over her desk, her breath clouding the air despite the wood stove crackling fiercely in the corner. Her fingers, numb from hours of scribbling notes, paused over her weathered field journal. The pages were smudged with dirt and snow, their edges curling from years of use. A single name was etched on the cover, Denali Study, Ursus Arctos Populations. The title pulled her back to the first time she had stepped foot in this wilderness. A vibrant graduate student with a backpack full of dreams and a head full of curiosity. That was before life had weighed her down, before her mother's illness consumed her world like a creeping frost. Now, Rachel was just a shadow of that young woman, weathered and worn like the mountains outside her window. She leaned back in the creaking wooden chair, the motion releasing a low groan. Her eyes wandered to the locket around her neck. It was a delicate thing, its gold finish dulled by time. Inside, a photo of her mother smiled back, a black and white portrait from years ago when life felt infinite. Rachel ran her thumb over the locket's edge, a habit she had fallen into since her mother's death 6 months earlier. The grief was a heavy, unrelenting thing, like the snow that piled up outside her cabin. Each day, she shoveled her way out only to be trapped again by the next storm. It was a routine she had come to accept: wake, work, survive. Rachel's cabin was a lonely outpost in the Alaskan wilderness, situated just south of Denali National Park. The park itself loomed like a silent giant, its peaks clawing at the sky and disappearing into a shroud of gray. This was her sanctuary and her prison. Her days were spent tracking bear populations, a solitary pursuit that had once filled her with purpose. She would venture out with her snowshoes strapped tightly and her thermal gear layered against the biting wind, setting up motion-activated cameras and gathering data. The work was methodical, scientific, and utterly devoid of the emotional entanglements she had grown to fear. But nights like this one, when the fire's warmth barely reached her bones and the cabin felt like a tomb, brought her closer to the edge. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, magnifying every creak of the cabin and every whisper of the wind outside. Rachel stood abruptly, the legs of her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She crossed to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she looked out at the world beyond. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, coating the spruce trees and erasing the faint tracks she had left earlier in the day. It was a beautiful kind of desolation, the kind that made her ache with equal parts longing and sorrow. She turned away, her gaze landing on the photo hanging near the stove. It was a picture of her and her mother, taken just before the illness began to show. They were standing in front of the Denali Visitor Center, arms slung around each other, smiles wide and unrestrained. Rachel barely recognized the woman in the photo, the one with the bright eyes and easy laughter. Tonight, she couldn't bring herself to work any longer. She needed air, movement, anything to break the suffocating stillness. Pulling on her parka and lacing up her boots, she grabbed her headlamp and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a slap, sharp and unyielding, but she welcomed it. It was real, tangible, unlike the vague and endless ache in her chest. The snow crunched under her boots as she walked toward the tree line, her breath forming ghostly clouds that disappeared into the night. She aimed her headlamp at the forest ahead, the beam slicing through the darkness and illuminating the skeletal branches weighed down with snow. Rachel stopped at the edge of the forest, her heart pounding harder than the short walk warranted. She felt it again, that creeping sense of unease that had followed her since the storm began. She scanned the tree line, the beam of her light darting from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, the snow, and the endless, impenetrable dark. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She turned back toward the cabin, her steps quickening. The snow was falling harder now, the wind picking up and whistling through the trees. As she reached the porch, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The forest stood silent and unmoving, but Rachel felt its weight pressing against her all the same. Something was out there. She was sure of it. But not tonight. Tonight, she would retreat, rebuild the fire, and steel herself for whatever the next day might bring. Inside, she sank back into her chair, the locket cold against her skin. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back, willing herself to sleep. But the image of that dark forest lingered, and with it, the faintest flicker of anticipation. Something was waiting just beyond the trees. Something that would change everything. Rachel woke to the sound of wind howling against the cabin walls, its mournful wail cutting through the thick logs as if they were paper. The fire in the stove had long since died, leaving the room cold enough that her breath came in visible puffs. She shivered and wrapped the woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders, her mind struggling to shake off the haze of restless sleep. The faint light of dawn seeped through the frosted window panes, painting the cabin's interior in muted shades of gray. She hadn't dreamed, not in the vivid, meaningful way she used to before her mother's passing. These days, her sleep was an empty void, a brief escape from the weight of waking life. But last night had been different. A shadowy image lingered at the edges of her memory, a forest cloaked in snow, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, and the sense of being watched. Rachel pushed the thought aside as she threw on her heavy flannel and trudged to the wood stove. The iron door creaked in protest as she opened it and began stacking kindling. Each piece of wood was carefully chosen, as if the ritual might restore some semblance of order to her disheveled mind. When the fire finally caught, it crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. As she sipped her first cup of coffee, hot, bitter, and slightly burnt, Rachel's gaze fell on the corner of the room where her snowshoes leaned against the wall. They were still damp from her outing the day before, and the sight of them stirred an unease she couldn't quite name. She had spent years exploring these woods, studying its inhabitants with a reverence few could understand, but something about last night's walk, about the way the forest had seemed to hold its breath, had unsettled her. Still, she told herself, the forest was her domain, it was where she had built her life, even as everything else had fallen apart. She couldn't let one night of unease shake her resolve. The day's work awaited. Rachel layered up against the cold, donning her insulated jacket, gloves, and a knit hat pulled low over her ears. She clipped a radio to her belt, strapped her snowshoes to her boots, and shouldered a pack filled with supplies, her journal, a GPS tracker, protein bars, and a thermos of tea. She hesitated only briefly before adding her flare gun, tucking it into an outer pocket just in case. Stepping outside, she was greeted by a world transformed. The snowstorm had blanketed the landscape in pristine white, erasing the tracks she had left the day before. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost. Rachel adjusted her headlamp and set off toward her first camera station, the crunch of her snowshoes the only sound breaking the morning stillness. The journey was arduous, the snow was deeper than she anticipated, and the effort of lifting her legs through the drifts quickly left her breathless. The forest closed in around her as she moved deeper into the trees, the dense canopy overhead filtering what little sunlight managed to pierce the overcast sky. She paused occasionally to catch her breath, her gloved hand resting against the rough bark of a spruce tree. Each time, she scanned her surroundings, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. By the time she reached the first camera station, the sky had turned a steely gray, threatening more snow. Rachel knelt in the snow, brushing it away from the base of the tree where the camera was mounted. The metal casing was icy to the touch as she opened it, extracting the memory card with practiced ease. She replaced it with a fresh one, her hands trembling slightly from the cold. It was as she stood to leave that she saw them, tracks. They were faint, nearly obscured by the fresh snowfall, but unmistakable. A set of large paw prints trailed through the clearing, their spacing indicating a slow, deliberate pace. Rachel crouched to examine them more closely, her breath catching in her throat. They were fresh, no more than a few hours old, and they didn't belong to a lone bear. Smaller prints clustered around the larger ones, like satellites orbiting a planet. 6 cubs? The realization hit her like a physical blow. It was unheard of for a mother bear to have such a large litter, let alone keep them all alive through the harshness of winter. Rachel's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The tracks were headed deeper into the forest, toward an area she rarely ventured, an old, abandoned logging road that had been swallowed by the wilderness years ago. She stood, her eyes following the tracks as far as she could see before they disappeared into the trees. For a moment, she hesitated, the memory of last night's unease pressing against her like a shadow. But curiosity and concern won out. If there truly was a mother bear with 6 cubs out there, she couldn't turn back now, not when their survival might depend on her. The trek grew more difficult as the day wore on. The tracks led her through dense thickets and over frozen streams, the snow growing heavier with each step. Rachel's muscles ached, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps, but she pressed on, driven by a mixture of determination and something deeper, a sense of kinship with the struggling family she was pursuing. As the afternoon light began to fade, she found herself at the edge of a small clearing. The tracks ended abruptly, the snow churned and packed down as if something, or someone, had lingered here for a while. Rachel's eyes scanned the area, her pulse quickening. She saw no sign of the bears, but the remnants of their presence were everywhere, claw marks on the bark of a nearby tree, a scattering of pine needles disturbed from above, and the faintest scent of musk in the air. She dropped to one knee, studying the signs with a trained eye. The mother bear had been here, she was sure of it. But where had they gone? And why did the clearing feel so eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath? Rachel rose slowly, her headlamp casting long shadows across the snow. Her hand instinctively brushed against the flare gun in her pocket, a gesture of both caution and resolve. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of purpose, a fragile, flickering light in the vast, wintry dark. Rachel remained in the clearing, her breath misting in the frigid air as the forest stretched out endlessly around her. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world in an unnerving stillness. Every instinct in her body told her to move, to keep searching, but an unshakable feeling rooted her in place. Her eyes darted between the trees, scanning for movement, for any sign of life. But all she found was silence. She crouched again, running a gloved hand over the packed snow. The mother bear and her cubs had spent time here, that much was certain. The ground was a tapestry of signs, the deep imprints of large paws, the smaller, erratic patterns of the cubs' tracks, and the disturbed snow where they had likely rested. She touched the claw marks on a nearby tree, feeling the rough grooves under her fingers. The marks told a story. The mother had scratched at the bark, not out of aggression, but likely as a desperate attempt to find food. Rachel's chest tightened as she pictured the bear, gaunt and weary, trying to sustain not only herself but her impossibly large litter. "This isn't sustainable," Rachel muttered aloud, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. The realization filled her with equal parts dread and determination. She couldn't let this family vanish into the wilderness, to die unseen, unrecorded, and unhelped. Rachel followed the tracks as they veered off into denser forest, her snowshoes crunching loudly in the stillness. The deeper she went, the darker the woods became. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading light. Her headlamp illuminated the way, but its beam seemed feeble against the vastness of the forest. Each step felt heavier, as if the snow itself was trying to hold her back. The tracks began to show signs of struggle. The mother's paw prints were dragging slightly, her pace uneven. One of the cubs' tracks veered off briefly before returning to the group. Rachel knelt to examine the prints, her heart sinking. The cubs were likely growing weaker, the cold, the lack of food, it was too much for them. She closed her eyes for a moment, the image of the mother bear and her cubs vivid in her mind. She imagined their small bodies shivering against the cold, their cries muffled by the snow. The thought was unbearable, a sharp pang that pierced through her resolve. As the light faded completely, Rachel knew she couldn't go much farther without risking her own safety. But just as she was about to turn back, she heard it, a sound so faint she almost thought she imagined it. A whimper. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, this time clearer, a high-pitched, plaintive cry that sent a jolt through her body. She turned her head slowly, her headlamp sweeping across the trees until the beam landed on a small, dark shape huddled against the base of a tree. A cub. Rachel's heart pounded as she approached, each step careful and deliberate. The cub was barely moving, its tiny body curled into a ball, shivering violently. She knelt a few feet away, speaking softly to calm both the animal and herself. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The cub lifted its head weakly, its dark eyes glassy with exhaustion. Its fur was matted with snow, and its breathing was shallow. Rachel's throat tightened as she reached into her pack for a thermal blanket. She unfolded it and inched closer, wrapping the cub gently in its warmth. The small creature let out a feeble cry but didn't resist. "You're okay," she murmured, cradling the cub against her chest. Its body was alarmingly light, its ribs too prominent under her touch. "Where's your family?" She looked around, her headlamp cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of the mother bear or the other cubs. The forest felt vast and empty, a silent witness to the cubs' abandonment. Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't leave the cub here, not in its fragile state. But taking it with her meant separating it from its family, a decision that weighed heavily on her. She glanced down at the cub, its eyes fluttering closed as it burrowed into the blanket. It was so small, so vulnerable. I can't just leave you, she said softly, the words more for herself than for the cub. I'll find them. I promise. She secured the cub in her pack, leaving the top unzipped so it could breathe, and set off again, following the tracks with renewed urgency. The forest seemed to close in around her, the cold seeping through her layers and into her bones. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Rachel refused to stop. She couldn't. The tracks led her to a narrow ravine, its edges treacherous with ice. Rachel hesitated at the top, her headlamp illuminating the steep descent. The mother bear's tracks were clear, she had climbed down, her weight leaving deep impressions in the snow. The cubs had followed, their small prints scattered along the slope. Rachel's breath hitched as she considered her options. The ravine was dangerous, especially in the dark, but the tracks were fresh. If she turned back now, she might lose them. She tightened the straps of her pack, adjusted her snowshoes, and began the descent. Halfway down, her foot slipped on a patch of ice, sending her sprawling to one knee. The cub in her pack let out a startled cry, and Rachel clutched at the nearest branch to steady herself. "Shoo," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's okay. I've got you." She forced herself to her feet, her muscles trembling with the effort. The bottom of the ravine was shrouded in shadows, but she could make out faint movement ahead. Her heart leapt as she realized what she was seeing. The mother bear. The bear stood at the base of a tree, her massive frame silhouetted against the snow. She was gaunt, her ribs visible even from a distance, and her movements were slow and labored. The remaining cubs huddled close to her, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. Rachel's breath caught in her throat at the sight. She stayed still, her mind racing. The mother bear hadn't noticed her yet, but any sudden movement could startle her. Rachel knew she needed to act carefully, both for her safety and for the family's. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and stepped forward slowly, her voice low and steady. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm here to help." The mother bear turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto Rachel's. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the forest holding its breath as two mothers, one human, one bear, faced each other in the stillness of the snow. The air between Rachel and the mother bear felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Every instinct in Rachel's body screamed at her to run, to turn and flee back the way she had come. But she stood her ground, her legs trembling beneath her. She tightened her grip on the branch she had used for balance, her gloved fingers pressing against the rough bark as if drawing strength from the ancient tree. The mother bear's gaze was unwavering, her dark eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and wary determination. She took a single step forward, her massive paw sinking deep into the snow. The cubs at her feet shifted nervously, their small bodies huddling closer to her for protection. Rachel's breath hitched as she noted their thin frames, their fur patchy in places where hunger and the harsh winter had taken its toll. "I don't want to hurt you," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the faint rustle of the trees. "I just want to help." The cub in her pack let out a weak cry, the sound piercing the stillness like a plea. The mother bear's ears perked up, her head tilting slightly as she identified the source. Her gaze shifted to Rachel's pack, her nostrils flaring as she caught the familiar scent of her missing cub. Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly lowered herself into a crouch, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The snow beneath her knees was cold and wet, soaking through her insulated pants, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the bear. "You've lost one, haven't you?" Rachel murmured, her voice trembling. "I found them. They're safe. She carefully unzipped her pack, revealing the small, blanket-wrapped bundle inside. The cub stirred weakly, letting out another soft cry as the cold air hit its fur. The mother bear took another step forward, her massive frame looming over Rachel. Her breaths came in slow, visible puffs, each exhale a testament to her weariness. For a moment, Rachel's resolve wavered. She had spent years studying wildlife behavior, observing bears from a safe distance, always careful not to interfere. But this was different. This wasn't a research subject or a data point, this was a mother fighting to keep her family alive, and Rachel couldn't bring herself to step away. She reached into her pack, her hands trembling as she lifted the cub free of the blanket. The small creature let out a soft whimper, its tiny paws flailing weakly. Rachel extended her arms slowly, offering the cub back to its mother. The bear hesitated, her dark eyes flicking between Rachel and the cub. The tension in the air was palpable, a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. Rachel held her breath, her muscles aching from the effort of staying perfectly still. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for the bear to decide. Finally, the mother bear took another step forward, her muzzle lowering to sniff at the cub. The warm puff of her breath brushed against Rachel's hands, and she fought the urge to flinch. The bear's nose touched the cub's fur, and a low, guttural sound rumbled from her chest, a sound of recognition, relief, and longing. Rachel felt tears sting her eyes as she gently placed the cub on the snow between them. The mother bear nuzzled the cub closer, her massive paw scooping the small body into the warmth of her side. The reunited cub let out a soft, contented cry as it nestled against its siblings, and Rachel's chest tightened at the sight. But the moment of relief was fleeting. As Rachel watched the mother bear, she noticed just how dire the situation was. The bear's ribs were painfully visible, her fur dull and matted. The cubs were in no better shape, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. They were starving, and the harsh winter would only make their survival more uncertain. Rachel's mind raced as she considered her options. She couldn't simply walk away and leave them to their fate, but what could she do? Feeding them directly could disrupt their natural instincts, and bringing them to a rehabilitation center would require capturing them, an ordeal that could traumatize both the mother and her cubs. Her eyes wandered to the trees surrounding the ravine, their branches heavy with snow. She knew the area well. Just a few miles east was a cluster of berry bushes and a partially frozen stream. It wasn't much, but it could buy the bear's time, a chance to regain some strength and keep moving. "I can help you," Rachel said softly, more to herself than to the bear. She rose slowly, her legs stiff from crouching. The mother bear watched her warily but made no move to attack or retreat. Rachel took it as a sign to proceed carefully. She backed away a few steps, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. Once she was at a safe distance, she turned and began her ascent back up the ravine. The climb was grueling, her snowshoes slipping on the icy incline, but she pressed on. Every few steps, she glanced back to make sure the bears were still there. The mother bear remained in place, her cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies barely visible against her massive frame. When Rachel finally reached the top, she paused to catch her breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She scanned the horizon, her mind mapping out the quickest route to the berry bushes. It was risky, there was no guarantee the bears would follow her, and even if they did, there was no way of knowing if the food would be enough. But she had to try. Rachel reached into her pack and pulled out the flare gun, firing it into the air. The bright red streak arced across the sky, its crackling burst cutting through the silence. It wasn't just a signal for the bears, it was a declaration to herself that she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when there was still a chance to save them. As the light faded and the forest returned to its quiet stillness, Rachel took a deep breath and began her trek toward the berry bushes. Behind her, the mother bear let out a low grunt, and Rachel turned to see her massive form slowly rising from the snow. One by one, the cubs followed, their tiny bodies wobbling but determined. For the first time in months, Rachel felt a spark of hope, fragile, fleeting, but undeniably real. Together, they would face the wilderness. Together, they would fight for survival. Rachel moved through the forest with deliberate care, the crunch of her snowshoes muffled by the dense blanket of snow. The world around her felt alive in a way it hadn't before, the trees and shadows seeming to watch as she led the way. She glanced back, her heart lifting and sinking at the same time. The mother bear was following her, the massive creature lumbering slowly through the deep snow. Behind her, 6 cubs struggled to keep up, their tiny bodies pushing through drifts that reached nearly to their bellies. Rachel noticed the weakest cub lagging behind, stumbling over its own paws only to be nudged forward by its siblings. It was a silent display of resilience, but it tugged at her in a way she hadn't expected. Just a little farther, Rachel whispered under her breath, as much to herself as to the bears. Her breath clouded the air, the sharp cold biting at her cheeks and nose despite the scarf wrapped tightly around her face. The flare gun sat snug in her pocket, a weight she hadn't realized she was clutching until now. The journey was agonizingly slow. Every step forward felt like a battle against the elements. The snow seemed to deepen with every passing moment, the weight of it pulling at Rachel's legs. The occasional wind gust sent flurries swirling around her, the icy particles finding their way into the small gaps in her clothing. Her fingers, despite the insulated gloves, were numb, and she flexed them periodically to keep them moving. She glanced over her shoulder again. The mother bear was moving more slowly now, her head low and her breaths visible in the freezing air. Rachel couldn't help but admire the bear's quiet strength. Every movement was deliberate, every ounce of energy conserved, yet she kept going, driven by the same determination Rachel felt growing inside her. An hour passed, then 2. The dense forest began to thin, the trees growing farther apart as they approached the small cluster of berry bushes Rachel had hoped to find. Her memory hadn't failed her. The bushes were there, their skeletal branches bowed under the weight of snow, the frozen remnants of berries clinging stubbornly to the twigs. Rachel dropped to her knees beside the first bush, brushing off the snow with gloved hands. Her movements were hurried, desperate. The berries weren't much, but they were something, a chance, however slim, for the bears to regain a fraction of their strength. She looked back again, catching the mother bear's dark eyes. The bear had stopped just at the edge of the clearing, her body tense and her cubs clustering around her. Rachel swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice breaking the eerie silence. She stepped back from the bush, gesturing to it with an outstretched hand. "Go on. It's for you." The bear hesitated, her gaze flicking between Rachel and the bush. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward. Rachel held her breath as the bear reached the bush and began to nuzzle the branches, her large paw gently pulling it closer. One by one, the cubs followed, their tiny noses sniffing at the berries before tentatively nibbling at the frozen fruit. The sight filled Rachel with a mix of relief and sorrow. The bears were eating, but it wasn't enough. The berries were sparse, and the energy they would provide was limited. Rachel knew this was just a stopgap, a temporary reprieve in a battle that was far from over. She sank to the ground, exhaustion washing over her. Her legs ached, her back throbbed, and her fingers burned with cold, but none of that mattered as she watched the bears. For the first time in months, she felt connected to something beyond her grief, beyond the cabin that had become both her refuge and her prison. Rachel's thoughts drifted as she watched the mother bear tend to her cubs, nudging them closer to the berries when they strayed too far. The scene stirred memories of her own mother, memories she had tried to bury under the weight of her work. She saw flashes of her mother's hands, calloused from years of gardening, guiding her through their small backyard as a child. She remembered the way her mother had stayed by her side during her hardest moments, offering quiet strength when words failed. Tears pricked at Rachel's eyes, but she blinked them away. There was no time for that now. The bears needed her, and she needed to focus. As the bears continued to eat, Rachel rummaged through her pack, pulling out her field journal. She flipped to a blank page and began jotting down notes, her handwriting hurried and uneven. She recorded everything she could, the bears' condition, their behavior, the location of the clearing. Her pen hovered over the page for a moment before she wrote, "Mother bear exhibiting remarkable resilience despite severe malnourishment. Cubs appear weak but are mobile. Current survival probability uncertain." The words felt clinical, detached, far removed from the emotions churning inside her, but Rachel knew she needed to keep documenting. It was the only way to make sense of the chaos, the only way to find a path forward. As the light began to fade, Rachel's thoughts turned to the next challenge, finding shelter. The bears couldn't stay in the open overnight, not with temperatures dropping and predators potentially lurking. She scanned the clearing, her eyes landing on a rocky outcrop at the far end. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the wind and snow. She stood, her body protesting the movement, and began walking toward the outcrop. The mother bear watched her, her gaze sharp and assessing, but Rachel didn't stop. She reached the rocks and knelt, clearing away the snow to reveal a small hollow beneath the largest boulder. It wasn't spacious, but it was sheltered. She turned back to the bears, her voice soft but firm. "Come on, over here." The mother bear hesitated again, but the cubs began to follow Rachel, their tiny forms stumbling through the snow. The mother let out a low grunt, urging them closer to Rachel as they approached the shelter. By the time the bears settled into the hollow, the last traces of daylight had disappeared, leaving the world in darkness. Rachel sat nearby, her back against the rocks, the warmth of her flare gun pressing into her side. The bears were only a few feet away, their soft breaths filling the quiet night. Rachel tilted her head back, staring up at the canopy of stars above. For the first time in what felt like forever, the silence didn't feel oppressive, it felt peaceful, filled with the quiet strength of a mother's love, both human and bear. And for the first time, Rachel felt a flicker of hope. The cold crept into Rachel's bones as the hours passed. She shifted against the rocks, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The forest was utterly silent, save for the occasional rustle of a branch or the soft huffs of breath from the bears nearby. She didn't dare light a fire, the smoke or light might scare the bears away or attract predators. Instead, she relied on her own body heat and the resolve that had carried her this far. The stars overhead blinked faintly, their light filtering through the skeletal branches. Rachel tilted her head to the side, watching the mother bear and her cubs nestled in the hollow beneath the boulder. The mother bear lay curled around her cubs, her massive body forming a protective shield. One cub shifted, letting out a tiny sound before burrowing deeper into her side. It was a scene of raw, primal love, and it gripped Rachel's heart with an intensity she hadn't expected. Her mother's face came to mind again, unbidden. The memories were vivid now, as if the quiet had unearthed them from the layers of grief and denial she'd buried them under. She saw her mother staying up all night by her bedside when she had the flu as a child, her hand cool and steady against Rachel's fevered forehead. She remembered the way her mother had whispered reassurances after her first major failure in college, telling her, "It's not about the fall, Rachel. It's about how you stand back up." Rachel shook her head, trying to focus on the present. She couldn't afford to be lost in memories now. Her gaze shifted back to the bears. The mother bear's breaths were slow and labored, her sides rising and falling with visible effort. Rachel noted the tremble in the bear's legs when she adjusted her position, a sign of exhaustion that sent a pang of worry through her chest. They couldn't stay here long. The hollow provided temporary shelter, but it wasn't enough to shield the bears from the relentless cold, and food remained a pressing concern. The sparse berries from earlier were gone, consumed in desperation, and the mother bear's condition made it clear that she couldn't lead her cubs to a better foraging ground alone. Rachel pulled out her field journal, flipping to a new page. Her pen hovered over the blank paper, the words forming slowly as she tried to make sense of the situation. The mother bear is severely malnourished. Cubs are underweight but showing resilience. If no substantial food source is located within 48 hours, survival likelihood diminishes significantly. She stared at the words, the finality of them settling like a stone in her stomach. Setting the journal aside, Rachel leaned her head back against the rock and closed her eyes. The exhaustion of the past days was catching up with her, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind churned with possibilities, ideas for how to help the bears without driving them away. When dawn broke, the forest came alive with muted light. Rachel's body protested as she stood, her joints stiff from sitting in the cold for so long. She stomped her feet and flexed her hands, trying to shake off the numbness. The bears were stirring too. The cubs yawned and stretched, their tiny bodies trembling as they rose from their makeshift den. The mother bear was slower to move, her large head drooping as she nudged her cubs toward her. Rachel watched them, her heart heavy. She needed a plan, and she needed one fast. Her mind drifted to a stream she had passed on her way here. If the water wasn't completely frozen, there might be fish, an unlikely find this far into winter, but worth the risk. She also remembered spotting a nearby patch of shrubs known to attract small mammals. If she could direct the bears to the area, they might find some sustenance. Her decision made, Rachel stepped forward cautiously, keeping her voice low as she addressed the bears. "We need to move," she said, her tone calm but firm. "There's a stream nearby. It's a better chance than staying here." The mother bear's head lifted, her dark eyes meeting Rachel's. For a moment, Rachel thought the bear might ignore her, might choose to stay curled around her cubs in the hollow. But then the bear shifted, rising slowly to her feet. She let out a low grunt, nudging her cubs to follow. Rachel felt a wave of relief and trepidation. This wasn't just about guiding the bears anymore, it was about keeping them alive. And every step they took together felt like a gamble against the wilderness. The trek to the stream was grueling. The snow was deeper than Rachel remembered, and every step felt like a battle against the unyielding cold. The bears followed her at a slow, deliberate pace, the mother bear occasionally pausing to nudge a lagging cub forward. Rachel glanced back frequently, her heart clenching at the sight of their struggle. When they reached the stream, Rachel's hopes lifted momentarily. The water was partially frozen, but pockets of it still flowed beneath the ice. She crouched by the edge, using a sharp rock to break through the thinner layers. Her breath came in quick puffs, her hands trembling from both the cold and the effort. The mother bear approached cautiously, sniffing at the water. Rachel stepped back, giving her space. The bear dipped her muzzle into the icy stream, emerging moments later with a small, wriggling fish clamped in her jaws. She passed it to one of the cubs, who devoured it eagerly. It wasn't much. One fish wouldn't be enough to sustain them, but it was a start. Rachel stayed at the stream's edge, breaking more ice and watching as the mother bear repeated the process. Her movements were slow, her strength clearly fading, but she persisted. The sight filled Rachel with both admiration and despair. How much longer could this bear keep going? How much longer could she carry the weight of her family? Rachel looked away, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest. Her gaze fell on the shrubs she'd remembered, their branches heavy with frost but still intact. She moved toward them, brushing off the snow and exposing the small burrows beneath. Her heart leapt when she spotted signs of life, tiny paw prints leading in and out of the holes. The mother bear's instincts seemed to take over. She sniffed the air and lumbered toward the shrubs, her cubs trailing behind. Rachel stepped aside, watching as the bears began to dig, their movements slow but determined. It was a small victory, a moment of survival in a season that offered so little. As the bears fed, Rachel sank to her knees, exhaustion washing over her. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the locket beneath her jacket. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "It's not about the fall, Rachel. It's about how you stand back up." For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like she was standing up, against the grief, against the odds, against the unrelenting cold. And for the first time, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. The forest was painted in hues of silver and white, the morning light filtering through the trees in gentle golden rays. Rachel stood motionless by the edge of the stream, her breath clouding the air as she watched the mother bear and her cubs finish their meal. The mother's movements were slow, deliberate, but there was a steadiness in her that Rachel hadn't seen the day before. The cubs, their tiny bodies still frail, stumbled and played near the bushes, their curiosity pulling them in different directions. It wasn't much, Rachel thought as she adjusted the scarf around her face. The fish and scraps they'd found weren't enough to sustain them for long, but it was a start, a fragile hope in the midst of winter's unrelenting grip. Rachel crouched by the stream, her gloved hands brushing the icy water as she retrieved the last fragments of broken ice. Her fingers ached from the cold, but the routine of working, of doing something tangible, grounded her. She glanced back at the bears, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and worry. They had come so far, but the journey wasn't over. Her eyes wandered to the mother bear, who now lay stretched out on the snow, her massive body shielding the cubs from the icy wind. The bear's breaths were deep and slow, her exhaustion evident in the way her head rested heavily on the ground. Rachel could see the toll the harsh winter had taken on her, the hollows beneath her eyes, the patches of fur that had thinned to reveal her ribcage, the limp she carried in her back leg. And yet, the bear had kept going, carrying her cubs through the snow with a determination that Rachel couldn't help but admire. Rachel's thoughts drifted as she leaned back against a tree, her body sinking into the cold bark. Memories of her mother came unbidden, vivid and sharp against the backdrop of the forest. She could almost hear her mother's voice, calm and reassuring as it had been during the hardest moments of Rachel's life. "You always find a way, Rachel," her mother had once said, placing a warm hand on her shoulder after a particularly grueling field assignment. "Even when the world feels too heavy, you find a way to lift it." The memory brought tears to Rachel's eyes, and she let them fall unashamed. The grief that had felt suffocating for months now felt lighter, tempered by the understanding that her mother's love still lingered, woven into the fabric of who she was. The hours passed slowly, the light shifting as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Rachel worked quietly, using her multi-tool to clear more ice from the stream and piling snow into a makeshift windbreak near the hollow, where the bears had taken shelter. Her movements were methodical, her focus sharp. It wasn't just about helping the bears survive another day, it was about giving them a fighting chance for the weeks to come. She knew she couldn't stay forever. The wilderness had its rules, its balance, and she was only a visitor here. The bears needed to rely on their instincts, and Rachel needed to trust that she had done enough to tip the scales in their favor. By late afternoon, the bears began to stir. The mother bear rose first, shaking snow from her fur and stretching her massive frame. The cubs followed, their small bodies bounding clumsily over the uneven ground. Rachel watched as the mother bear sniffed the air, her ears swiveling to catch the faintest sounds of the forest. It was time to move. Rachel stood, her muscles protesting the movement after hours of stillness. She took a step toward the bears, her boots crunching softly in the snow. The mother bear turned to look at her, their eyes meeting one final time. "You'll make it," Rachel whispered, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I know you will." The mother bear let out a low grunt, a sound that Rachel chose to interpret as acknowledgement. She watched as the bear gathered her cubs, nudging them gently into a line before lumbering toward the forest. The cubs followed in single file, their tiny forms disappearing into the shadows one by one. Rachel stood rooted in place, her heart aching as the bears faded from view. She felt a pang of fear for them, a deep, primal worry that they might not make it through the winter. But she also felt something else, hope. They had made it this far against impossible odds. If they could survive another day, perhaps they could survive the next, and the one after that. The forest grew quiet once more, the sound of the bears' movements replaced by the soft rustle of the wind. Rachel closed her eyes and let the silence envelop her. She thought of her mother again, her voice a whisper in the back of her mind. "Even when the world feels too heavy, you find a way to lift it." Rachel smiled faintly, her breath a visible puff in the cold air. She adjusted her pack, feeling the comforting weight of her field journal against her back, and began her trek toward home. The snow was deep, and the path ahead was uncertain, but Rachel moved with purpose. As she walked, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the forest in hues of orange and gold. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel felt light, like the weight of her grief had melted away, leaving her free to carry something new, the quiet strength of a mother bear, the resilience of her cubs, and the promise of spring just beyond winter's grasp. Through the biting cold and the relentless challenges, the mother bear and her cubs found a way to keep going, proving that even in the harshest winters, there is hope and strength in the bond of family. Rachel's journey with them reminds us all of the power of resilience, compassion, and the small actions that can make a big difference. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss more incredible stories like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.